Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into a really tricky area of contract law today, modification. You sign a contract, seems solid, but then life happens. Things change.
Mhm.
So what happens when circumstances shift dramatically and one side asks for, well, more money to do the exact same job they already agreed to? Is that new promise even enforceable?
That's the core tension, isn't it? The clash between what the contract originally said and what seems fair or necessary later on. We're zeroing in on whether that promise for extra cash has valid consideration, especially if the person getting paid more is already legally bound to do the work anyway. So our plan is this. Start with the traditional rule, the pre-existing duty rule, PDR for short. We need to get why it exists.
It stops people from taking advantage, right?
Exactly, to prevent what's often called the holdup game. Then we'll track how modern law, especially the restatement second, carved out crucial exceptions for voluntary agreements when things genuinely pop up that nobody saw coming, unanticipated difficulties.
Okay, sounds like a plan. So let's start at the beginning. What is the traditional baseline rule about modifying a contract? Does it always need new consideration?
The general rule, the starting point is yes. A modification is basically treated like a new contract. And just like any contract, it generally needs its own consideration to be binding. The pre-existing duty rule really defines what isn't consideration in this spot. It says promising to do something or actually doing it when you're already legally obligated. That's not new consideration. Same goes for not doing something you weren't allowed to do anyway.
Ah, okay. So if I already owe you a duty, just promising again to do that same duty doesn't count as giving you something new legally, even if you promise to pay me more for it. Seems logical, but maybe a bit rigid in practice.
It is logical, yeah. Think about a simple debt case like Rose v. Daniels. If someone owes, say, $10,000 and the lender agrees to take just $5,000 to call it even, that promise to accept less often fails. Why? Because the debtor paying $5,000 is just doing part of what they were already legally required to do, pay the full $10,000. The lender gets no new legal benefit.
Right, that makes sense. And you mentioned this rule helps prevent the holdup game.
Hmm.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. Let's dig into Alaska Packers Aston v. Domenico. This is like the poster child for that problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
Let's analyze Alaska Packers Aston v. Domenico. First, what are the legally dispositive facts? Lay them out for us.
Okay. So back in 1900, you have these 21 sailors who sign a contract. They agree to sail from San Francisco way up to Pyramid Harbor, Alaska, pretty remote place for the fishing season. Their pay was set, $50 each, plus a small bonus per salmon caught, standard stuff. But once they get to Alaska, miles from anywhere, they just stop working, flat out refuse. They demand another $50 each. And they threaten to just pack up and head back to San Francisco if the company doesn't agree. Now, the company foreman is stuck, can't find replacement workers out there, so he agrees to the demand. But when they all get back to port after the season, the company says, nope, not paying that extra $50.
Wow, talk about being over a barrel. Okay, and what was the core legal issue the court had to decide?
The key question was pretty direct. What have to pay an extra $50 actually supported by consideration? Or did it fail because the sailors were, already obligated by their first contract to do the work for the original pay?
And what rule did the court apply to figure this out?
They went straight to the classic pre-existing duty rule, very strict application. The rule says, basically, if you're just promising to do what you're already legally bound to do, that's not consideration for a new promise.
So how did the court's analysis go? What was their reasoning?
Well, the analysis really focused on the coercion. It was pretty clear-cut. The sailors already had a contract to work the whole season as sailors and fishermen for the agreed pay. Their threat to just abandon the job wasn't a negotiation. The court saw it as, frankly, economic extortion. It was the hold-up game in action. The companies promised to pay more. It didn't secure any new performance or legal benefit from the sailors they weren't already entitled to. The court basically said the law won't step in to enforce promises that are extracted through that kind of pressure or duress.
Right. Makes sense from a policy perspective.
Yeah.
And the conclusion. What was the final outcome?
The conclusion followed directly. The agreement for the extra $50 was totally unenforceable because it lacked consideration. The sailors only got what they were originally promised.
Okay, that outcome feels right for preventing blatant coercion. But, like we hinted at earlier, what about situations where things change for genuine reasons? Does the PDR sometimes end up being, well, too blunt an instrument, punishing parties who face real, unforeseen problems and try to work things out fairly? How have courts dealt with that side of things, especially when there's clearly no duress involved?
That's the really interesting evolution here. Courts definitely recognize the problem. While they kept the PDR on the books, especially for Alaska Packers type situations, they became, let's say, reluctant to apply it rigidly when parties encountered truly unanticipated difficulties. Things nobody could have reasonably predicted. And crucially, where the other party voluntarily agreed to pay more to deal with it. Historically, courts sometimes used, well, legal fictions to get around the PDR in these fair situations. They might say the original contract was rescinded or abandoned and then instantly replaced by a new one. You see this in older cases, like Linz v. Schuck, involving unexpected quicksand during an excavation, dramatically increased the cost, you see.
Huh. Rescission and replacement sounds a bit like legal gymnastics to reach the fair result without overturning the old rule directly.
Right.
Is there a more straightforward modern rule now? One that acknowledges this need for flexibility?
Yes, exactly. The modern approach, and what many consider the better rule, is found in the Restatement Second of Contracts, specifically Section 89DA. This section provides a path for a modification promise to be binding without new consideration, but only if it meets three specific criteria. It effectively creates a structured exception to the PDR for these non-coercive situations.
Okay, that sounds important. What are those three criteria? Let's lay them out.
All right, number one, the modification has to happen before the contract is fully performed on either side, so while the work is still ongoing. Number two, the circumstances that led to the modification must have been genuinely unanticipated by the parties when they first made the contract. Not just bad luck, but truly unforeseen. And number three, the modification itself must be fair and equitable considering those changed circumstances.
Unanticipated, fair, and equitable. Got it. How does this connect, if at all, to deals involving, say, the sale of goods? Is there similar flexibility there?
There is, yeah. It shows a broader trend. The Uniform Commercial Code, the UCC, which governs sales of goods, has Section 22009. It goes even further, actually. It says, an agreement modifying a contract for the sale of goods needs no consideration at all to be binding. Full stop. But, and this is key, it still has to meet the test of good faith. So the UCC also prevents using modifications for extortion or holdups just through a different lens than consideration. It focuses on legitimate commercial reasons.
Okay, let's make this concrete. Time for hypothetical to really nail down this difference between a holdup and a legit modification under the restatement. Imagine you're building a house. You hire a contractor, fixed price, $50,000 to dig the foundation. Standard stuff. But halfway through, bam, they hit this massive, totally unexpected layer of solid granite, something no reasonable soil test would have shown, let's say. The contractor comes to you and says, look, this is totally unforeseen. I need an extra $15,000 just for the blasting equipment and time to get through this rock. Otherwise, honestly, I can't finish the job. You need the house, so you agree. Is that $15,000 promise enforceable under the restatement view?
Ah, the granite hypothetical. Perfect. This really gets to the heart of it. The absolute key is distinguishing between just running into difficulty, which happens, that's a risk of business, and something genuinely unanticipated. So if that granite was truly beyond what anyone could have reasonably expected, and your agreement to pay the extra $15K was voluntary and seemed like a fair adjustment for the massive extra work, then yes, that modification likely does satisfy the restatement's requirements. Unanticipated circumstances, and fair and equitable. The court would probably enforce it. It's seen as a good faith adjustment to a mutual problem.
Okay, but now contrast that.
Yeah.
What if the contractor didn't hit granite? What if they just realized halfway through, oops, I seriously underbid this job by $15,000, and they use the threat of walking off as leverage to get you to agree to pay more?
Now that sounds much more like Alaska Packers, just maybe with a bulldozer instead of a fishing net. Underbidding is generally considered a contractor's risk, something anticipated in the business. It's not an unanticipated circumstance in the restatement sense. That demand for $15K extra would likely fail the restatement test. It lacks the unanticipated element, and it smells like duress, like the hold-up game. The law wants to allow flexibility for the granite, but still block the underbidder's threat.
Got it.
Yeah.
That distinction is critical. Okay, now let's apply this modern restatement framework to the main case we're looking at today, Angel v. Murray. This case seems to have really grappled with adopting this newer rule. Let's analyze Angel v. Murray. First, can you give us the legally dispositive facts? What happened here?
Sure. So Mr. Marr had a 5-year contract with the city of Newport to collect all the city's refuse, their garbage. The contract was for a fixed annual sum, $137,000. Now, when they made this deal, everyone expected some growth, maybe 20 or 25 new houses being built each year. That was the historical average. But then in 67 and 68, something totally unexpected happened. Instead of 25 new units, there was this huge surge. 400 new dwelling units suddenly came online. This obviously meant a lot more garbage and significantly higher collection costs for Maher than anyone planned for. So Maher went to the city council, he explained the situation, laid out the increased cost due to this massive unforeseen growth, and requested an additional $10,000 per year. Importantly, this wasn't done in secret. There was a public meeting, the council discussed it, and they voluntarily agreed to pay the extra $10,000 for 2 years.
Okay, 400 units instead of 25 is definitely a big jump. And what was the core legal issue when this ended up in court?
The issue boiled down to this. Was that city council vote to pay Maher the extra $10 a legally enforceable modification? Or did it fail under the old pre-existing duty rule because technically Maher's original contract already required him to collect all the city's refuse, regardless of how many new houses popped up?
And which rule did the Rhode Island Supreme Court decide to apply here? Did they stick with the old PDR?
No, they didn't. This was the key moment. The court explicitly decided to move away from the rigid PDR for this type of situation. They formally adopted and applied Section 89DA of the Restatement Second of Contracts. They saw it as the better, more modern rule for handling voluntary modifications driven by unforeseen events.
All right, so they used the restatement test. How did the court's analysis look when they applied those three criteria, executory, unanticipated, and fair equitable, to Maher's situation?
They went through it step by step, meticulously. First, was the contract still executory? Yes, clearly. It was a 5-year deal, and the modification happened midterm, so check. Second, were the circumstances unanticipated now? The court found that the sudden addition of 400 units went beyond any previous expectation. Nobody disputed that fact. Check. Third, was the modification fair and equitable? The court said yes. Given the substantial and unexpected increase in workload and costs, the extra $10,000 was deemed a reasonable price adjustment. Check. And crucially, the court also highlighted that the city council's approval was voluntary, made openly in a public meeting. This negated any argument about duress or coercion.
So it hit all 3 points of the restatement test, plus voluntariness. And the conclusion, what was the final ruling?
The final ruling was that the modification was binding and enforceable. The lower court had actually ordered Maher to pay the $20,000 back to the city, relying on the old PDR. The Supreme Court reversed that. They said Maher gets to keep the extra payments. So pulling all this together, what does it mean for you if you're looking at a contract modification problem, maybe on an exam or in practice? You really need a kind of diagnostic checklist, a step-by-step way to figure out if you're dealing with an Alaska Packers holdup or an Angel v. Murray fair adjustment.
Yeah, that synthesis would be incredibly helpful. A practical checklist. Walk us through it. How should we approach these modification questions?
Okay, step 1 is the initial rule check. Start with the traditional PDR. Ask, is the party asking for more money, the promisee, actually giving any new legal detriment? Or is the party paying more, the promiser, getting any new legal benefit they weren't already owed? If the answer is no, like the sailors and Alaska Packers offering nothing new, then the modification likely fails right there for lack of consideration under the basic PDR. Step 2, the policy check. Ask yourself, does this feel like a holdup game? Is there evidence of coercion, bad faith, extortion, duress? If yes, even if circumstances were arguably unanticipated, the strong policy against duress means the PDR likely still applies and the modification should fail. Step 3. If it doesn't look like coercion and the modification was apparently voluntary, then you pivot to the restatement exception check. This is where Angel v. Murray comes in. Apply that 3-part test from Restatement Section 89DA. 1, is the contract still executory? 2, were the circumstances truly unanticipated by both parties? 3, is the modification fair and equitable given those circumstances? If all 3 are met, it's likely enforceable without new consideration. And finally, step 4, the special context check. Just quickly ask, is this contract about the sale of goods? If yes, remember UCC 22191, you don't need consideration. We absolutely do need good faith. No extortion allowed there either, just a different legal hook.
That's a fantastic framework. Start with PDR, check for coercion, apply the restatement exception if it's voluntary and unforeseen, and remember the special UCC rule for goods. That was a really thorough exploration of how the law tries to balance predictability with fairness when unexpected things happen in contracts, moving from that rigid PDR towards recognizing good faith adjustments.
Exactly. It really shows modern contract law aiming to uphold agreements people make willingly and fairly, even if they bend the older, more technical rules. But it does so while keeping those essential guardrails up against the kind of economic pressure we saw at Alaska Packers. It's a balancing act.
Definitely. Okay, here's a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Think back to Marr and the city of Newport. What if their original contract hadn't just been silent on growth, but had included a phrase like, adjustments may be needed for unanticipated increases in dwelling units or similar difficulties arising from population changes? Would adding just those few words or similar difficulties have potentially put that massive 400-unit increase back into the category of anticipated risks? Could it have changed the outcome under the restatement? Something to mull over until our next deep dive.